So let's talk about a subject that I find extremely fascinating. Anytime I bring up anything to do with the evils of the right wing, the racism, the violence, the eugenics, the Darwinism, all of that Darwinian religion, that Darwinian ideology, anytime you bring this up and then you make the connection between right-wing ideology and fascism, what do you always hear? Antifa are the real fascists. The real Nazis are Antifa, guys. It's Antifa. Those purple-haired, obese SJW third-wave feminists, those are the real Nazis. All right, they're the fascists because Winston Churchill said that the fascists of today are going to operate under the guise of being anti-fascist, even though Winston Churchill never said that. Winston Churchill never said that. In fact, they're not entirely sure where that term or where that saying came from. But the reality is that this sort of talk, this sort of language, this sort of reasoning, it's quite inept. And it ignores the historical reality of the right-left dichotomy. Yes, they are points where the right and the left where they meet. They are points where they overlap, but you can't ignore the reality that the anti-fascists and the alt-right or the right-wingers hate each other. In America, it's kind of retarded. Like, American Antifa is a joke for the most part. The right wing in America, they have, the anti-immigrant sentiment and all that stuff. But when they do it, they lack a lot of aesthetics, and they don't have the marketing skills of the European right wing. European right wing is pretty serious, and European Antifa, they're also pretty serious. Very intelligent, very resourceful when it comes to information, very efficient when it comes to intelligence and logistics. They're no joke. Why? Because there is an extremely long history of the left-wing, right-wing battle in Europe. It's been going on for a very long time. You can link it all the way back to the 18th century. Now, how did we get here? This is the question that I want to address in this video. How did we get here? Because people will sit here and say, well, Antifa, they're the real fascists. And they overcomplicate things. Because when you look at the Western right wing today, be it the Austrian or German or French identitarians who are rooted in the French New Right, be it the Greek Golden Dawn who are right now on the border with Turkey fighting the migrant invasion, which is basically a way to cover up for their own racist ideology. If you look at the Alternative for Deutschland Party, the Sweden Democrats, the Forum for Democracy Party in the Netherlands, these are all within that strata of the right wing. Look at the Brexit movement, it lies all within the strata of the right. Within the European Antifa, you have a lot of effective activism, be it through music, be it through propaganda, things of that sort. And so people will say, well, the right wing in Europe, they are, and America, these guys are the true anti-fascists because they're fighting fascism. This is actually a strategy, and not a lot of people talk about this, but this is actually a strategy that was utilized by the new right wing in the post-Second World War era. After the Second World War, the right wing, they were the losers because the Nazis were right wing. They were the losers, so they had to find out a way to remarket themselves. This was a very efficient strategy. So they began to present themselves as being like the new fighters of fascism. And what they said was essentially that the liberals, they're the ones who are close to the Nazis, and we are like those who fought against the Nazis. We're like those who were a part of the anti-Nazi resistance. The identitarians in the New Right, in the French New Right, and also in the right wing after the Second World War, they utilized this strategy as a way to represent themselves. It was an optics thing. But people could see right through that, because while they will praise certain anti-Nazi resistance fighters, at the same time, they will espouse and push for views that are blatantly and conspicuously Nazistic and Hitlerian. Racial purity, being demographically homogenous, being anti-immigration, all that stuff. So at the same time, it's like you can't escape this reality, the reality of the fact that you have people who call themselves left-wing and people who call themselves right-wing who hate each other. And so to sit there and say, well, Antifa, they're the real fascists, and these right-wing guys, they're the anti-fascists. They're the guys who are trying to save Western civilization. They're the guys who are trying to fight fascism. This way of thinking, it ignores the reality of right-wing Darwinistic ideology and the fact that it still exists and it's still here. Fascism never died. That's the part that this way of reasoning ignores, that it never died. After the Second World War, because the right wing lost and the liberals were the winners, and hence why America worked with the Soviet Union and helped the Soviet Union fight the Nazis and vice versa. They were the losers and all that, and they needed a way to remarket themselves, and so they didn't go to sleep, but they went into hiding a little bit. They went incognito, so to speak. The migrant crisis, be it the migrant crisis on the American southern Mexican border, or be it the migrant crisis that's going on in Europe, in Greece, and in southern Italy at the moment, this sort of situation has unleashed a nationalist phenomena, and thereby giving these right-wingers the green light to espouse Hitlerian and Nazistic views. That's why, for example, you'll have members of the Golden Dawn saying that Hitler applied National Socialism the right way. If you're interested in that, I will post an article underneath the video that I wrote today on Greek nationalism, and you can read it and learn more about what I'm talking about. So it ignores the reality of what is right-wing ideology. The ideas of racial purity, the ideas of the state being the arm by which the governing powers protect the race and protect racial purity and all that stuff. That is all within right-wing ideology. Benito Mussolini had this. They were people who were in Francoist Spain who had these sorts of ideas. Not saying Franco had these ideas himself, but they were people who were big within Spanish fascism, who indeed had ideas of La Raza, the Spanish race, the purity and the glory of the Spanish race. The Germans, obviously, we all know, they had these views as well. The Swedes also had this view. And so these ideas, they never died. They never died. They never did. Now, how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, it's very fascinating. So let's go back into history. Okay, I do long videos. So if you don't like long videos, go watch, I don't know, some guy who talks like a university nerd, who has a video where he doesn't show his face and he just has pictures and he talks about sustainable gardening or something like that. This is not for you. Or I do long videos because I read a lot and I think a lot. I want to do a video about what I'm thinking about. So how did we get here? So the history of the political phenomena of Europe. At one point in time, Europeans killed each other over religion. There was no Darwinism, there was no right wing, there was no left wing, there was no communism or Marxism. There was Christianity. Christianity was the dominating influence of Europe. And there, in this situation, in this historical era of Europe, people killed each other over religious differences. It's just a fact. And I'm not bashing Christianity, but it's just a fact. Like if you look into the history of Europe, people killed each other over theological differences. And so Europeans, they weren't killing each other over, whether or not Hitler applied Marxism correctly or whether or not Stalin applied it correctly. People were killing each other over whether or not God wants a church in Rome or whether or not he wants churches in different regions as what, the Protestants wanted. People killed each other over this. They killed each other over whether or not the Eucharist is the body and blood of Jesus. They killed each other over whether or not confession is a valid sacrament. They killed each other over whether or not marriage is a valid sacrament. You had Catholics versus Albigensians. Albigensians believed that, marriage isn't a sacrament, confession is not necessary, the Eucharist isn't the body and blood of Jesus. Catholics believed it. They killed each other for like 15 years. Then you had Catholics versus Hussites. The Hussites said, well, we don't need to be under Rome. We could have a church right here in Bohemia. Hussites and Catholics killed each other for about 20 years in a very, very bloody conflict. Then you had the civil war between the Swiss Catholics versus Swiss Protestants in the Kappel Wars. And that was very bloody. And then you had the 30 Years' War. 30 years, Christians killing each other over theology. And, that eventually evolved, or devolved, I should say, into just fighting over territory and fighting over political power and all that stuff. People used religion to establish political power. It's not the fault of religion, but it's the fault of people wanting to use religion for their own desire of power. And so that's why you had people saying, oh no, the church is wrong, I'm the right guy, because those guys wanted power over people. The French, they wanted the Vatican, they wanted the headquarters of the Catholic Church to be in Avignon in France. And there was violence over that. So, the camera just moved. So, in the era before Marx and Darwin, this is how things were. In the French Revolution, there was violence. There were enough people, who believed that the church was not only insignificant, but an enemy of France. Because they had this idea that in a true ideal society, the Catholic Church is not present because the Catholic Church to them promoted inequality. You had the lay people, and then you had the priests and the bishops and the archbishops and cardinals, and then you had the Pope. It's all inequality. So in their Masonic way of thinking, they have to destroy the church in order to establish pure equality. And so they had their revolution. And this was basically the end of... The French Revolution marks the end of Christendom. Before the French Revolution, Christendom was dying because of the inundation of Enlightenment ideology. The French Revolution was the point where Christendom died. Napoleon used the revolution to take power, and he then told the church that they have no longer any influence in France. They can't have any influence in government. And they outlawed church bells, and they, in the French Empire, when the French took over Malta, they told the Knights of St. John, hey, you guys are gone. It marked the death of Christendom. So what did that bring about? Well, let's talk about that. So in the time right after the French Revolution, there was a certain philosopher by the name of Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte was a French philosopher who was a product of the French Revolution. He was a product of that anti-Christian, chaotic, ideological strata. And Auguste Comte is considered to be the father of sociology. And Auguste Comte believed in a religion of man where God is no longer God. The true God is humanity. Human beings are divine. And because we are God, we rule over the ideological zeitgeist of the world. And so there was one guy in particular who really believed in Auguste Comte's philosophy. By the way, this philosophy is known as positivism. This guy's name was Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is famous for coining the phrase survival of the fittest, which we've all heard. A lot of people think that survival of the fittest, the term itself came from Darwin. That's a misconception, a very common misconception. The term survival of the fittest comes from Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was a deep believer in the idea of positivism, or the idea that society evolves, morality evolves, ideology, religion, all these things, they evolve. And so what Comte believed was that at one point in time, human beings believed in religion, but then human beings intellectually and spiritually evolved away from religion. So Comte believed in spiritual and intellectual evolution. Spiritual and intellectual evolution. Human beings evolve. So therefore, people who still believe in religion, they are in the inferior case of society. Herbert Spencer was a firm believer in positivism, and he believed that society society evolves, right? Societies evolve. But he didn't have a scientific argument for his beliefs until Darwin. Darwin comes in and says, humans evolve. Humans evolve. And Darwin was very much so influenced by a certain Anglican minister by the name of Malthus. And Thomas Malthus believed that human beings need to basically kill each other off in order to balance the population so that enough food will be available for humans. Darwin took this idea and said, hey, and people talk about Darwin and how he came up with this theory, but people don't talk about the fact that he was influenced by Malthus. Because what Malthus said was that, hey, certain people need to be killed off. Certain people need to be gotten rid of. And Malthus didn't say, hey, get guns and get death squads and shoot people, but what Malthus said was, do certain government policies that would lead to the deaths of people. So, for example, he said that that streets should be narrower, or streets in between buildings, streets within cities should be narrower, thereby forcing people to be closer to each other, thereby allowing bacteria and viruses to spread faster. He also talked about purposefully neglecting cleaning up the water supplies for certain areas in England. Malthus was English. Thereby allowing bad viruses or all viruses are bad, but allowing viruses to contaminate the water and thereby contaminating people and killing them. So Malthus believed in governmental policies that would lead to slaughtering people, that would lead to murder, in order to balance the population so that there will be enough food for everyone. Because if there's too many people, then you can't feed everyone. So he said, kill off certain people so that you have a balanced population, so that you have enough food for the people. Darwin took this idea and said, wait a second, if certain people die because there's not enough food, or if certain people die because they're too weak, then their genes don't perpetuate, their genes don't propagate. And so if only certain genes propagate because the carriers of those genes are strong enough, then those are the genes that we want. And from that, you have the idea that charity is bad because it allows the weak to survive. Helping certain people is bad because it allows the weak to survive. Therefore, we should do policies that would lead to the deaths of the weak. And so here you have the application of survival of the fittest. So Darwin took Malthus's idea of allowing certain people to die, and he applied it to genetics. He applied it into a genetic paradigm and said, well, if certain people are going to die because they're weak, then, we don't want them anyway. They're not needed. So only the strong should be allowed to live. Only the strong should be allowed to eat the food. so that their genes may continue on. And because human beings have evolved from lower primates, well, we continue to evolve. We continue to evolve, and we are continuing to evolve, and eventually we're going to become Superman. So with Darwinism, Herbert Spencer got his scientific argument for positivism. He got a scientific argument for the idea that society evolves. Not only do we evolve spiritually and ideologically and politically, we also evolve biologically. We are constantly changing genetically. We have evolved from lower species and we are becoming something greater. We are evolving into the Übermenschen that Friedrich Nietzsche talked about. So who does Darwin eventually influence? Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx said that eventually the idea of serfdom and the idea of peasantry and the bourgeoisie and the nobles and all that stuff, eventually all this stuff is going to die out because society eventually evolves away from that through class struggle. So he said that inevitably there would be a violent clash between the rich and the poor, and eventually you would have some sort of a Marxist utopia. So because Darwin said, hey, humans evolve, Herbert Spencer believed that society evolves, Marx believed that society would eventually evolve into a Marxist utopia. We would eventually evolve through class struggle into something greater, into something superior, into something that is superior to the capitalist system that we have. So from this, and with this, we can see an entire shift in the Western world, in the world actually, in the world, not just the Western world, but in the world. Because before, Europeans had Christianity. Now Europeans had Darwinism. From that, they get materialism, essentially. That's what they get. So from that, they get materialism. And everything is seen through a materialistic perspective. Marxism is pure materialism. That's why today you'll hear Marxists say things like, well, the reason why certain people are criminals is because they weren't given a fair chance. The reason why certain areas have high rates of crime isn't because of morality, because morality is something that is contrary to materialism. It's because those people don't have enough money. You hear this all the time, right? The reason why they're poor is because they don't have enough money. Give them more money and they'll be less violent. There's social inequalities, financial inequalities. That's why they're so crime-ridden. Whereas Christianity would teach, yes, you are poor, but at the same time, you have to be moral. Being poor does not mean that you have a right to steal or to murder. Yes, you are poor, but Christ said the poor shall inherit the earth, or the meek shall inherit the earth. Christ taught us to respect the poor. Christ taught us to protect the poor. Christ taught us to protect the poor from exploitation. And in the Christian mentality, there is no shame in being poor. And at the same time, Christian principle teaches, even if you are poor, you shouldn't be a criminal. Thou shalt not steal. Marxism, because it's purely materialistic, says, you know, the reason why you're a criminal is because you're poor and you need someone to help you. So everything is materialism. Everything is materialism. And so what does that eventually lead to? It eventually leads to the left-right paradigm. The left-right paradigm. Both the left and the right have socialistic thinking. That's why the Nazis had National Socialism. Yes, today the right wing in America loves to talk about the glories of capitalism, but at the same time, these types of people talk about why we should have entirely a free market. Corporations should be allowed to function as they want without regulation. What would that lead to? It would lead to an overreach of corporate power, and that's what fascism was in fascist Italy and also in Nazi Germany. Fascism, while it does have socialistic ideas and aspects, fascism is ultimately about corporate power over the people, over the average person. That is why big companies like what's it called? Mitsubishi had work camps. Big companies like IG Farben had work camps. Big corporations. Why? Because a part of fascism and a part of National Socialism is extreme overreaching power to corporations. Now you could say, well, it's contrary to the socialist thinking of helping the poor. You can say that, but there's no reasoning in this sort of in materialism. In materialism, there's plenty of contradictions. Like the French Revolution hated the church and said we want to help the peasant, but who suffered the most? Who were the people being killed the most in the French Revolution? The peasants. So I'm not here to smooth out the contradictions. I'm here simply to present the reality of materialism and the fact that they are contradictions, but to say, well, how do you explain away the contradictions? You really can't, because the people who are pushing for either, far leftism or far rightism, they're both unreasonable people. You can't reason with these people, so there's no point in trying to, make reasons or to present a reasonable, or to have a reasonable presentation of these ideas. So you have Darwinism, and that changes everything. It's no longer Christianity, it's Darwinism. The main influence of the world is no longer Christianity. It is Darwinism. Plain and simple. It is Darwinism. And with that, you have materialism. And with that, you have fascism and you have communism. Human life is therefore simply a means to an end. An end. That's all it is. It's a means to an end for a specific priority of corporate power and state power. When you have this in mind, the idea that, well, those right-wingers in Europe, they're the real anti-fascist, that idea is completely retarded, because it ignores the reality of Darwinism and how entrenched Darwinism is in the world. Because as long as you have Darwinism, the right wing will promote Darwinian ideology. That's why you have, for example, the Golden Dawn talking about shooting migrants and the purity of the Greek race. Why? Because in the Darwinian materialistic thinking, it's all about the genetics. It's all about the flesh. That's why, for example, Frauke Petry, one of the leaders of the Alternative for Deutschland party, another right-wing party, she talks about a Darwinian struggle between the Arabs and the whites. You look at this reality, and you just can't say, well, the righties are the good guys. You can't say that, because the whole left-wing, right-wing paradigm is the result of Darwinian thinking. Now, you can argue and say, well, no, it goes back to the 18th century in France, and the right wing supported the king, and the left. Yes, you're right. But the people who supported the king were Catholics. People like René de Chateaubriand and those like him. These people were Catholics, and they were against racism. In fact, René de Chateaubriand, in his book, The Genius of Christianity, he talks about how the Catholic Church is against racism and against exploitation of the poor, against exploitation of indigenous people in South America. He talks about how the Jesuits, fought against the slave trade and all that stuff. So the people who supported the king and the people who were against the French Revolution, you can't say that they're the righties of the Darwinistic world that we're living in now. It's completely different. Because the Nazis, they said, hey, we take socialism from Marx, we take our views on biology from Charles Darwin. And Benito Mussolini, he took stuff from Darwin. He also took socialistic ideas. Although he didn't call it socialism, he called it syndicalism or syndicalism. And that was all about, the supremacy of unions and all that stuff. So this idea that the right wing, they're the true anti-fascist, it's garbage because it ignores the reality of Darwinism and how influential Darwinism is. And also, even if the people who espouse themselves as right-wing, even if they say, hey, we're Christians, we're Orthodox Christians, we're Roman Catholics, we're trad Catholics, even if they say these things, they're still fascist because they are against the migrants. They talk about you know, the importance of the nation state. They'll talk about, you know, racial homogeneity. They talk about these things, and that's why when you look at American geopolitics and all that stuff, who does America tend to support? Who does America tend to support? Because when you look at NATO, when you look at the history of America supporting other countries, one thing that you will find is that America loves to support fascism. That's why after the Second World War, America was bringing in all these Nazis into the United States, giving them six-digit figure salaries. That's why the United States armed right-wing terrorists under the Gladio operation. That's why all of these things happened. There was a coup in Bolivia recently. It was a right-wing fascist coup. The United States supported it. So America itself has fascistic tendencies. That's why we have abortion. That's why we will have certain entities within the United States who back infanticide, and they will work with other entities in Europe, like the Max Planck Institute. That's why you have coordination between Planned Parenthood and these, you know, laboratories who are in the business of making or doing experiments on aborted fetuses. Now you can say, well, the left supports abortion. Yes, but let's not forget, the left is a result of Darwinism and materialism. The left-right paradigm is the result of Darwinism. So as long as you have Darwinism, you're going to have left-wingers supporting abortion. You're going to have left-wingers talking about, you know, why we need to kill off, you know, millions of people to save Mother Earth. And at the same time, as long as there is Darwinism, you are going to have right-wingers talking about the purity of the race, why we need homogeneity, why allowing foreigners and outsiders are going to ruin the genetic makeup of the people. Again, it's all about the race. It's all about materialism. It comes from Darwinism. The left wing will say we need abortion because certain people are too poor and they need to get those abortions because they can't afford to have children. Again, this comes from a Marxist Darwinian way of thinking. The reason why they're having abortions is because they're poor, and they need to have abortions because they're poor. And there's a lot of eugenic underlying stuff with that. And then with the right wing, it's, well, abortions are okay as long as the people having abortions aren't white. And I've heard people say things like this. Or they'll say things like, we need eugenic policy in order to prevent the country from being inundated with non-whites. And, you know, you'll see stuff like this from Stefan Molyneux. And you'll have trad Catholics listening to Stefan Molyneux. You'll have conservatives listening to Stefan Molyneux. And they think he's great. Why would they think he's great? Because conservatives, they're under that right-wing paradigm, and as long as they're under that paradigm, they are susceptible to believing in Darwinistic ideology. That's why you can go into a Catholic church and hang out with trad Catholics, and they'll talk about how great Stefan Molyneux is, they'll talk about how great Lawrence Southern is, they'll talk about how great identitarians are, how great Martin Sellner is, Brittany Pettibone, all that stuff. They'll talk about how great Brexit is, ignoring the fact that Brexit was heavily influenced by Dominic Cummings, who is a eugenist and a Darwinist and an eco-fascist. They ignore all this stuff, but they'll praise these people. Why? Because as long as you are right-wing, you are susceptible to believing in fascist ideology. Just as long as you are left-wing, you are, just as well as if you are left-wing, you are susceptible to believing in communism or some kind of socialism. So it's a very fascinating topic, and it's very interesting in that how the level of deception is that deep. People think, oh, we're great conservatives. At the same time, they're espousing fascistic ideas. That's why you will hear conservatives who claim to be Christians say things like migrants are leeches and they're bloodsuckers and we got to get rid of them. They have fascistic ways of thinking. If you look at America's foreign policy, who does America tend to support? Fascist countries or countries with fascist tendencies. Saudi Arabia is a fascist country. Turkey is a fascist country. The United States supports them. Japan is a fascist country. That's why, for example, I mean, Japan, it wasn't until the 1990s that they stopped sterilizing people. Peru also had a sterilization program. Peru was one of our guys at that time, and Peru is still an ally of ours. Why did we support these things? Why did we bring in all these Nazis into the U.S. and gave them 6-digit annual salaries? Why did we arm and train right-wing and Nazi paramilitaries under the Gladio operation? Why did all of that happen? Why did we back a right-wing fascist uprising in Bolivia? Why? Because America has itself fascist inclinations. It's very interesting. And if you're going to sit here and say, oh no, they're great conservatives, they're wonderful, they're this, Jesus Christ was murdered by fascists. Pharisees, with their idealistic views of having a puritanical Jewish society, those were the people who murdered Christ. It wasn't the pagans of Rome. It wasn't the Samaritans. It was those who believed in having their idealistic, Zionistic, purely Jewish state that murdered Christ. And so if you have these evangelicals who sit there and say, oh, these Zionists are wonderful, these settlers in Israel are wonderful, you are supporting the very people who would crucify the Messiah. Christ was murdered by fascists. And I've talked long enough in this video, so yeah. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.